our closing conversation, we have with us Dr. Shyam Bhatt. Dr. Shyam Bhatt is the chairperson of Live, Love, Laugh Foundation, a psychiatrist and an integrative medicine specialist. After a 12-year stint in the UK and the US encompassing medical training and practice, Dr. Bhatt returned to India in 2009 with a mission of practicing a holistic form of psychiatry and medicine that integrates the best of India's ancient therapies of mind and body, along with the latest evidence-based treatments from Western medicine and psychiatry. Having this conversation with Dr. Bhatt is Natasha Joshi, who needs no introduction. She's the curator of this festival and is a development sector professional who has worked with multiple organizations and foundations across India, Mexico, and Singapore, and is currently the associate director at Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies. Our closing panel is titled, Does India Needs Its Own Psychotherapeutic Approach? Here, Dr. Shyam will leverage his wealth of experience of working in this field to talk about his approach to psychotherapy, the differences between Western and Eastern practices, and how we can move forward in this space. Please put your hands together and welcome Dr. Shyam and Natasha Joshi.
It's such a pleasure to host this conversation at NIMHANS because we're able to bring in so many different ideas in this one platform. It's been wonderful. And we are so privileged to have you, Dr. Shyam, with us. I think the most obvious question that one wants to ask a psychiatrist, and I want to ask you, of course, is what got you interested in psychiatry? But also, can you tell us a little bit about the field of psychology in the sense that, what's the difference between a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a psychotherapist, a counselor? So just demystify that for us a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a common question and a difficult question to answer because it's quite nuanced. But a therapist is essentially a psychotherapist is one who does psychotherapy. So it's a functional word, but in terms of qualification, you can have a psychiatrist who does therapy, you can have a psychologist who does therapy, you can also have a social worker who does therapy.
So one is a function.
Therapy is a function,
okay.
But different qualifications, different backgrounds in our profession could do the function of therapy. Mm-hmm. And over the years, what's happened and all over the world, including in India, is that psychiatrists spend less and less time doing therapy and are essentially becoming psychopharmacologists, meaning spending more time on the medicine aspect of it. Yeah. And so a lot of people almost think that psychiatry has become synonymous with medication and psychology has become synonymous with therapy, which is not true, and which is unfortunate actually, because ideally you need an integration of different aspects,
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting.
And of course, so a psychiatrist is a person who's done an MBBS in this country, gone to medical college,
yeah, that's
and
how
then
I know it, yeah.
a subspecialty in psychiatry.
Okay, interesting. So, I think what's interesting that since you mentioned medicine, I think I was looking at your early sort of journey as a clinician, and I believe you worked in both the specialities, internal medicine and psychiatry, and that's not very usual. So one is just, could you explain also a little bit about what is internal medicine? Because now we know what psychiatry is. But
now, the audience primarily psychiatrists, and I wouldn't want to bore them with the details of what a psychiatrist is. How many people are psychiatrists in the room, just by show of hands? A couple, okay. So I do have to explain. Okay. Yes. So I did two specialties, psychiatry and internal medicine. After MBBS, you have to, you can pick a specialty if you want to specialize, right? And so you can think of three broad specialties. One is surgical specialties, which involves obviously surgery. The second is medicine, internal medicine, which is the initial specialization you do before you subspecialize in any one of the organ systems like cardiology, endocrinology, etc. Then you have psychiatry. So I did psychiatry and internal medicine, which are obviously usually very separate things. And I was fortunate enough to get into a very competitive residency program in the United States, which was a combined internal medicine psychiatry program.
Okay.
So instead of 4 years for psychiatry and 3 years for internal medicine, you compress the two into a 5-year program where we would spend half our time in internal medicine, half our time in psychiatry, half our time in inpatient psychiatry, half our time in inpatient medicine, and so on and so forth. Very intense programs. A program, at the end of it, you board certify in internal medicine and psychiatry separately. I'm sure this is the most interesting thing to people. This is quite boring, I know. But the point here, I think, is that by virtue of the amount of knowledge there is in medicine, we as a profession have had to specialize. And as we specialize, the danger is that we start taking a very reductionistic approach to illness, and we do not think of the integration. The reason I wanted to do internal medicine and psychiatry was when I first started doing psychiatry in the UK, and I felt that I had a real desire to understand even more so about physiology, about what you would call medical illnesses, because it was clear by then to me that this was an artificial distinction about what was mental illness and what is physical illness.
Could you say, like, how did that become clear? Was it?
So I think by the time I started psychiatry, I was interested in various things like identity, and that goes back to my childhood. And I often think that, to your question, why did I become a psychiatrist? I think, why did we do anything in our life? I think there are forces beyond our awareness, which start somewhere in circumstances beyond our control, like our childhood. So I was born in New Zealand, where my parents were doing their post-graduation. They're both doctors. Then they moved to Libya, which was a strange decision when you think about it. So I spent my entire childhood in Libya as a foreigner. So I was obviously a foreigner in a foreign country, and a country that doesn't allow you to forget that you're a foreigner. They remind you occasionally by throwing stones at you, for example.
Wow,
so anyway, the point is, as I grew up, I became very aware that identity, for human beings at least, was a very complex interplay between, it wasn't something intrinsic, but was rather a construct, and that construct was something that you were subject to by forces beyond your control, like where you grew up, what kind of culture you were exposed to, and so on. So because I felt I can observe in every culture, because I came to India, and although I'm more Indian than any other place, at that point, you didn't immediately resonate, right? I couldn't resonate with the country of my parentage and of my, So it led to this long process of really trying to understand what identity means. And so by the time I had started psychiatry, I had already been very interested in what Eastern philosophy was saying about mental health. And through meditation, yoga, and reading, it became apparent that Western psychiatry was extremely limited. Their entire history, in fact, seemed to ignore the fact that we had such great insights about mental and physical wellness thousands of years before their first theorist appeared in the Western Hemisphere. And hence, to me, the mind-body integration was very clear. And I don't think any layperson doesn't know the connection between mind and body. Every human being knows it, that when you feel something, you feel it in your body. We use it in our language all the time. You have a weight on your shoulders. You have knots in your stomach. You have butterflies. It's embedded metaphorically, and everybody knows it. And yet the field of psychiatry had ignored the soma, the body, in the West for the longest time, until recently. Thankfully, it's become a little fashionable. It's a good thing, though. But in the East, this was the longest, for the longest time, you've thought about mind and body health as one thing, not separate. So the insights that I was getting from there, I was really interested in seeing what can I learn in Western medicine by doing internal medicine, psychiatry, and then I did a subspecialty in psychosomatic medicine to see what I could find in terms of science and the integration or the integrative approach that was happening in the East. So that was what led to this.
That's interesting. From my limited sort of understanding of the movements that happen in psychiatry and even psychology in the West, for instance, there was this whole era of Freudian thinking. There was that logic. So I think from what I'm understanding from you is that may have been a trend, but really in terms of practice, it still remained fairly separate. And I'm just kind of curious about your work as a clinician in the US when you're working there. How did you understand the sort of therapeutic model there, and then what do you also see as some of those limitations? Like, how did that start to emerge for you a little bit?
The reason I finally came back to India was because of what I saw in the US and the realization that this is going to be our future unless we wake up and do something different in this country. It's clear, firstly, even in physical medicine, that you shouldn't follow data from the West because our population, our genetics, our physiology is different. But when it comes to mental health, the idea that we look to the West and we take their ideas, their techniques, their perspectives on mental health, when all evidence points to the fact that it's completely and utterly broken in that country. The United States spends, $300 billion plus annually on mental health. They have thousands of psychiatrists, thousands of therapists. Their very language is embedded with so much psychotherapeutic, psychobabble that you would think every person in the United States is a real great therapist. And despite all this self-awareness and self-care and self-love and all of this sensitivity, they have one of the highest suicide rates in the world, the highest homicide rates in the world, highest substance abuse rates in the world. It's a disaster. 14% of the United States takes SSRIs, nothing wrong with that, but they barely engage in all of the other practices, and in fact, the fabric of society itself causes that kind of mental illness. And the kind of psychotherapy they do only worsens the kind of hyper-individualistic, entitled fragility that their society causes. And I see this happening in our country because now we are kind of looking to the West, and I think we naturally feel that medical advances come from the West. Yeah. And that is true in the field of physical medicine. Sure. As far as mental health is concerned, because stress, anxiety, and depression rests on perennial human problems, there is perennial human wisdom about what to do about it in cultures all over the world. And the fact that we, the people came, colonized, took ideas, or taught us how to think about ourselves, and now if that comes in the guise of science, I think it's going to be very tragic for our country.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you're saying this, because some of the conversations we have heard even through the 2 days has been really about the role of course, society and community, because the idea is that, we talk a lot about treatment gap, but the solution clearly isn't creating more psychiatrists. I mean, you can't even, because there is just, when you look at the base that India has and the type of population we have, so clearly we have to figure out, community ways of sort of looking within and trying to sort of understand. So can you tell us a little bit about what this integration actually looks like, just in terms of maybe perhaps at the level of the individual and then stemming out from there? But what does an integral model actually look like in practice?
I think there's disintegration in our field in many, many areas. Firstly, there's disintegration in terms of the brain and mind. As I said, the problem where, because of peer systems, and why is it happening? Well, basically, as you said, psychiatrists are in short supply. It costs society more money to train a psychiatrist. It takes, therefore, more manpower, etc. And therefore, it's natural that you start splitting functions within the field, as I said, psychotherapy and psychopharmacology. That is a huge problem, actually. That itself is a huge problem because, many clinicians, when you prescribe a medicine, it's really important to think subtly of what psychological effects they're having. There's the mind is something amorphous, but it is there in the sense that when you do therapy, you're doing something with the so-called mind, which of course rests on the brain, but is something different in that it's bidirectional. We know, for example, psychotherapy, talk therapy, when effective, causes the similar changes in the brain as medicines. And the data tells us that for a lot of cases for depression and anxiety, you need both psychotherapy and psychopharmacology. That offers the best results. So that's the first disintegration that is occurring, right, between the brain and the mind. There's also a disintegration between the body and what we call mental health. And this is a huge problem, particularly for India and societies around the world which are defined as collectivist societies. Latin America, Asia. Data tells us that when people have depression and anxiety in such cultures, they have body symptoms, physical, somatic symptoms. The Western theorist will call this the somatization of something psychological, which I think is such cultural hubris to say that the right way to feel it is in your mind. If you feel it in your body, you are a naive, ignorant, Asian person. Yeah, it's quite the contrary. It is the most essential, authentic experience to feel it in the body. It is a mind-body experience. We don't verbalize our feelings after the fact. It's a post-hoc thing, right? First you experience the feeling. So I would argue that the entire construct is wrong, where somatic symptoms, which form the basis of this disorder in countless people, leading to the strange statistic that, for example, if you look at male suicide, the rates of male suicide is now 2.5 times that of female suicide, but the data will tell you that 50% of men who die by suicide do not have a diagnosable mental disorder.
Oh, that's interesting.
No, that's also ridiculous. I mean, how can you die of suicide and say you don't have a mental disorder? It's like dying of a heart attack and saying, there's no cardiac problem. It makes absolutely no sense. It means the diagnostic system was inadequate to capture the suffering of this person who died by suicide. And anecdotally in my work and talking with a lot of my colleagues, we see that a lot of people have somatic symptoms. They have body pains, aches, fatigue, abdominal pain, So in other words, when people die by suicide or they're suffering from this, their contact is not with the psychiatrist, their contact is with the general practitioner. Which is why, by the way, the whole idea of internal medicine psychiatry came up, the idea being that general practitioners, and this is true for India, have to be exposed to more psychiatry training in their curriculum. Do you know that MBBS has 2 weeks of psychiatry? And guess how many doctors show up for those 2 weeks? Very few. Most people, I don't know, things might have changed. I'm dating myself, I'm talking a few decades ago, but I don't know if there's overwhelming interest still. Even then, 2 weeks is nothing, right? Psychiatry, in my view, should be embedded into every other specialty. You do dermatology, you need to learn psychiatry. You do cardiology, you need to learn psychiatry.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The next disintegration is between different therapeutic systems. There are 101, thousands of ways to see a human being, to frame a human being, right? And again, because of academic turf battles and et cetera, you have, various schools, which is fine, nothing wrong with that. But I think every practitioner who's out in the field will be an eclectic therapist. They always are weaving together different approaches because you have to integrate that. But there is a disintegration in the insights from the West and the East.
Okay.
And this is quite central when you think about it, that in the East, when they talked about human happiness, and they talked about the attaining bliss, happiness was always, and could always be found, only be found rather, when you transcended the individual self.
Okay.
The self, the mind, came in the way between the individual and bliss. Was the teaching in the East, and not just a theoretical teaching, it was the point of meditation, to connect with the transcendent aspects of experience. And in that transcendence, you find happiness. As Zen said, no self, no problem. But in the West, it was quite the contrary. It is quite the contrary, where the idea is you become your best self. And the nauseating highest version of yourself. Oh God, what is that, right? Are we a software program? You keep updating yourself, 3.0, 4.0, not knowing that one day that program will stop. Where's the existential backdrop and framework to a lot of those therapies, So the integration of the transcendent with the individual, I think, is a very, very important integration that's also lacking.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. I think one thing that strikes me about this is there is now there's a lot of language around psychology and psychiatry, and it's also available on Instagram. And I think there's a lot of self-diagnosis. Somewhere I think there's a sense of comfort, I think, in getting a diagnosis, because sometimes if you feel something's amiss, something's not right with me, or just sometimes you're just having a mood, and you want to you go to the doctor, or you go to a psychiatrist and you say, look, I'm feeling this, this is how I'm feeling. And then many times you get a diagnosis. So first, what does that even mean? So what does it mean when you go to a psychiatrist and you explain yourself and then you get a diagnosis? So what is a diagnosis? What does that mean for you? But do you think that sometimes maybe there is a sense of comfort, like the way we think in physical medicine as well? And I think that's being challenged in the physical space as well now with physical health, that everything isn't just A condition or B condition. It is even the body is integrated, as you are saying, but very much in pure physical sciences as well. So speak a little bit about what does a diagnosis mean? Not definitionally, but what does it mean for a person when they get a diagnosis? And
I think it's a great question. And it's interesting phraseology when you said get a diagnosis. I see that in psychiatry, so get a diagnosis. So firstly, and I'm going to put on my internal medicine and psychiatry hat to compare how diagnosis is, because we have to understand where the science is in psychiatry. Where are we diagnostically in psychiatry is that we have symptom clusters that research says goes together, and that's given a label. That label is called a diagnosis.
Got it.
What we don't know, and in fact the profession has taken the position that we do not want to know, as far as diagnosis is concerned, what is causing the problem. When DSM first started in the 50s, I think, DSM-1, DSM-2, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the basis for psychiatric diagnosis, until 1983, which is when DSM-3 came out, it was based on psychodynamic theory, which meant two clinicians seeing the same person could have very differing ideas about what's going on. because they were thinking about causation, as often doctors do, by the way. We should think about causation. But it became a problem because person A says, you know, you are depressed because your father passed away, your person B says you're depressed because you have low self-esteem, and then it became an endless debate, and it was a lot of fun doing psychiatry back then, because there was no science, you could just talk, you know. But
a lot of questions after.
right. No, I'm thinking, I wasn't, by the way, I'm not that old, I wasn't practicing at that time. All right. I don't want to
So
give
not
the wrong,
you then.
these guys.
Everybody else.
No, yeah. So I've heard it was fun back in the day. No, you think about Freud, you know, smoking a pipe, doing cocaine. That's why the guy was doing cocaine, he was smoking a pipe, is making all kinds of weird statements and celebrated all these years for saying the weirdest things. And here you have Buddha, who in 500 BC came and said the most profound things, and in you know, Western psychiatry books, they've just ignored Buddha. They're like, oh, psychiatry started with Sigmund Freud. I don't know why. And so yeah, I think it was bad marketing, essentially, actually. I think Indians have never been good at marketing. Right? That's all it is.
Yeah, yeah. No, so
Buddha, for example, guy came up with such an amazing insight, but the marketing was so bad. First noble truth, life is suffering. That's not going to fly. You know, nobody on Insta likes life is dukkha, like. No, not happening.
you know, we have a partner. He was here, Nikhil Taneja, yesterday. He was talking to, he was in conversation with Rahul Dravid, and they work a lot with young people on sort of mental health. And I was telling him, we were having this kind of like conversation, both of us, you know, not very much young anymore. And we were saying how, you know, life is about balance and so on and so forth, and relationships. And he said, you know, Natasha, that's just not sexy. Like, I can't tell that to young people. You know, he said 80-hour weeks are sexy. Like,
that's
you know,
right.
Money is sexy. Like, this is not sexy.
No, it's horrible. I mean, the worst thing was I saw a book which was How to Be a Buddha in 6 Weeks.
Yeah.
I was like, guys, come on. The guy is like 8 years in the forest, left his wife, his kingdom and all, and some American guy's written How to Be in 6 Weeks. This is the problem with our society, you know.
But Dr. Sham, like, then what is the takeaway for like me? So if I say that, then what is the path, right? I mean, if we do want to do an integration sort of approach,
Right.
Is it a long process? Because something that's so seductive about diagnosis and medication is because, you know, suffering is real, and then you want something that
how to make
helps
it
you.
cool is what you're saying. It's a hard thing because you're right. Instagram is the biggest problem right now. I know that young therapists, many of them are learning from Insta University. It's dangerous. Okay. And guess what? Oh, you know, right? I'm hearing resonance in the house. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, Insta University, firstly, is all about making you feel good. And whichever meme is always applicable, you're always the good one in the meme. You know? Have you noticed?
Yeah.
You always look for things that justify your thing and make you feel right. And it's good in the moment, right? I'm not denying, and that's an important role even as therapists. Yeah. Firstly, I have to support someone. But there's a time in psychotherapy when we look at transformation, when you look at change, when you look at uncomfortable truths about yourself. One of the many problems I'm seeing with contemporary Insta University / American therapy is the rise of so-called trauma-informed therapy.
Just say more about that, yeah.
I'm trying to hold back and be very politically correct because I just want to preface, we live in dangerous times where I have to be very careful. I want to be clear, I'm very empathic and I care deeply, as we all do in this profession, about people, obviously. And we have always known that trauma is an important aspect to be explored, that people get hurt in a million different ways, and the way we get hurt, especially when we're young, informs many things, right? I have no problem with all of that. My problem is, why are we calling it out all of a sudden? Why are we suddenly raising it to a level of, if I'm trauma-informed means the rest of the profession is uninformed? It's like saying human-centric therapy. Yes, of course. Of course, you should be informed by trauma. Of course, you should be informed by empathy. But my problem with this is that it's creating a sense of entitlement, fragility, and actually will affect the way we interact with each other in society, where we'll be less free and ultimately less resilient. And this is a real problem. You know, one of the reasons why I think this conversation is so important, it's not about therapy alone. It's not about psychiatry. It is about society. One of the biggest normative factors in society is what's happening behind closed doors in the psychotherapist room. What they're talking about, how they're thinking about normalcy, how they're teaching vulnerable people what normalcy is. Those that vocabulary, that perspective that comes out on Insta, it comes out through media and shows, etc. And an entire society starts thinking about happiness, normalcy, all of these very important ideas through this conversation.
Yeah, I think
So-
it ties to something I've actually heard you say before, which is this idea of a hyper focus on the individual. Whereas we all exist in a context, in relationships, we all exist entangled with one another, you know. So I think when you just think of the individual and the individual cognition without that transcendence that you've talked about a little bit, I think that's perhaps something that needs to be taken in into the conversation, into practice, because clearly we do coexist with everybody else, and we affect each other's sort of well-being in some sense. I mean, if I understood correctly, I think that's also one of the things that leads to this kind of sense of alienation or atomization. It comes also from this feeling that it's me and my mind and just my problems.
There's a lot of things. The other thing that you have to be careful about is neuroreductionism.
Okay.
The idea that we are the sum, that we are entirely a result of our brain chemistry and brain function. Again, I'm a scientist too. I prescribe medicines when it's needed. But you will notice again on Instagram the sort of idea that you are a bunch of chemicals. So instead of saying, I want love, I've heard people say, I want some oxytocin. And so people saying, he feels pleasure, they're saying, oh, he gets a burst of dopamine. Now, it really doesn't add anything to that statement, I feel pleasure, to say I get a burst of dopamine, or makes people think eventually that your pleasure is a result of that dopamine, not that the dopamine was a result of pleasure. You see the absence of, the reversal of causality and the absence of context. What gives you pleasure and creates dopamine in your brain may not do that in another person's brain. So when they start being reductionistic, that sets the stage for a society that, what I saw in America, my biggest problem there, was a bulk of people would almost think of their brain and themselves like a car, how you take it into the mechanic, say, doctor, I'm not sleeping, I'm not feeling good, I'm not thinking, just, top up the fluids, put off the serotonin, dopamine, etc., etc. And what happens is you end up with a lot of prescriptions because they stop doing the hard work required in other areas.
Yeah.
India, of course, I think we are at the other end of the spectrum. Often we don't take medicines when necessary. That's also really important.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't think of ourselves as just a brain, without context.
Locomotives. So, I want to change tracks a little bit. Take these ideas that you have and let's look at the workplace. Because one of the questions we get a lot, as we have lots of partners who are non-profit organizations and they have teams. And a lot of times we get this question saying that the well-being of my employees, mental health is really suffering. How can I improve the mental health or the well-being of my team, my employees, my workspace? How do we think of that? I mean, sort of the practical applications in some sense. What can we do better? Or especially there are people in the room who may want to take that away in terms of is there anything to change?
When a leader asks, how do I handle the mental health of the team, it usually starts with the leader. We have to start there.
Okay.
Mental health trickles down in organizations. As human beings, evolutionarily, we are primates. Primates were in tribes, and as tribes, we always look to the leader to tell us whether you are safe, whether it's okay, whether it's not. And that continues in the boardroom today. Those who are in positions of power will have an outsized influence on the emotions of those who work, for them.
Yeah.
And so in an organization, it's always important to think about how the leaders managing their mental health. And then think about organizational culture that can help with mental health. And primarily those things are about autonomy, which is a big necessity, especially for the younger workforce. And that, I want to say work-life balance, but...
But it's not sexy.
But,
It's not
no, it's not just unsexy, it's also inauthentic. In that, the honest-to-God truth is in most organizations today, the organizational imperative is not your health.
Yeah, that's true.
And this is difficult because sometimes the conversation you hear is about health, about creating an organization that's healthy, but many times what's actually being told to the employees or the kind of behaviors that are elicited are not consistent. So I think an organization has to be authentic. I think it'd be better to have an organization which says, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a tough time. It's going to be pretty brutal, and it's going to be tough on your mind and body. sign up if you want, otherwise don't.
Yeah, manage.
It's also called the army, for example. I mean, they're not telling you any stories or being actually any job, a lot of jobs, right?
Yeah.
That's the point, though. My point being, I think authenticity and honesty is really important. Otherwise, what happens is you have an employee base who starts getting cynical. Once you have cynicism, then you're not going to create organizational change. So authenticity, where the leadership is actually, if you're going to do something about mental health, then you have to be very honest about what you can and can't do and how you're going to communicate to your employees. Especially the younger generation, I think we've always craved authenticity as human beings, but I think the younger generation is more clear about wanting it and will talk about it if it's not there.
Yeah, I was schooled by somebody younger who said it's called the say-do gap.
Say-do gap.
Say-do
I
gap,
like
what
that.
you
All
say
right.
versus what you do, or the organization says versus what it does.
That's right. So you got to close the say-do gap. I'm going to say that next time.
All right. You know, sticking with sort of the world of social work a little bit, and also kind of selfishly asking a question for philanthropy, because we are also a foundation that supports work in mental health. What does progress look like for the field of mental health? And for example, if you're making, we are making an appeal to funders, especially to say support more programs in mental health. But the question comes back, you know, what are the outcomes? What are the metrics? Like, how do we know the program is successful? Is there a kind of, the way we are saying there's an integration of East and West when we're thinking of psychotherapy, is there a way to integrate East and Western thinking even when it comes to metrics and success and things like that, which even philanthropy can take back?
I think it would depend on the program and what your focus area is. There's lots of outcome measures. I mean, socially, you look at suicide rates, for example, as an index of how much mental unrest and distress there is in the country. You can look at physical illnesses like metabolic syndrome as an index of stress. They're actually highly correlated. And because, by the way, there's a lot of data now looking at depression increasingly as also an inflammatory disorder, right? And so there's again, going back to what is mind, what is body, what is causation, if there's inflammation, that could potentially give rise to different diseases like diabetes and depression. So in fact, there's data, for example, saying that if you have diabetes, you have twice the risk of depression and the other way around. So you could have various index measures, you could have quality of life measures. I think though, in the ultimate analysis, the hallmark of a mentally healthy society is actually going to be how few people suffer the worst of mental illness. What I mean by that is, stress is a commonplace thing. And I think a mentally healthy society would have made the practice of managing stress, the various habits and practices that help you maintain your physical and mental health as sort of a commonplace activity. And I often wonder why we are not taught that in schools. Why are we not taught about how to manage your mind, how to maintain your mental health in schools? So I think a mentally healthy society would have that.
Okay, that's really helpful. I think one of the sort of interesting questions in terms of just moving forward also is how do you also talk more about this and create more conversation for this? And you've been in this field now for a very long time, and you've been in India also for a while. If you could just tell us what has changed in the conversations when it comes to mental health in the last, let's say, decade, or even the last 15 years. Like, what has actually changed? Some for the better, some maybe not, but just your view on what has actually changed.
I don't think we addressed the diagnosis that you asked me.
Yeah, sure.
Right? To go back to where we are in diagnosis, like I said, it's a constellation of symptoms. And because we moved from saying that if you get into causation, it's too complicated, let's talk about diagnosis without causation, right? That's where we are now. But when you think about what that means, in physical medicine, the analogy would be when a patient walks in with cough, fever, and yellow sputum, and that is given a label, and that's called a disease. Now, in physical medicine that cough, sputum, and fever could be 100 different things. It could be pneumonia, bronchitis, asthma, cancer. It could be a systemic problem. It could be a lung problem. It could be practically almost innumerable diseases causing the same symptomatology. Conversely, in physical medicine, we know that the same disease can give multiple symptoms. Tuberculosis of the lung, tuberculosis of the brain, tuberculosis, it's very common. So now you consider the science of psychiatry. We are saying that a constellation of symptoms is a disorder because they cluster together. Fair enough. We know nothing about under the hood. right? It could be 10 different disorders causing the same thing. Conversely, what we're calling depression and bipolar could, under the thing, be the same thing. So because we had to take this atheoretical, etiology-free approach to diagnosis, it means actually, in a way, we have to understand as practitioners and as consumers the limitations of the science. When you talk about a diagnosis in psychiatry, it's not as real a diagnosis in that sense as diabetes. Diabetes is precise. You can check the blood sugar. Above 126, by definition, is diabetic range. So this is the problem with psychiatric diagnosis. Now, if you think that is very real as such, and you start then saying these are the brain scans consistent with this, what are you even talking about? Because you have 100 different subtypes or things that don't even... And so today what's happening in India is this neuro-reductionism.
Okay.
In America, you have unscrupulous practitioners who claim that they can make diagnosis using SPECT scans. I've had people ask me for that here, and of course you have the technology for SPECT scans, but you cannot make a diagnosis in psychiatry using brain scan because, as I said, we're just talking about symptom clusters. We don't even know what it means in terms of the brain. So there's a lot of, that's where the science is, it's very primitive. Firstly, let's, in all these years, psychiatry science is still very primitive.
Sure.
And I think what we are going to find out, unless things change significantly, I think for a long time to come, we will never solve the problem by just going into brain, and that's why the integration is important.
Sure, understood. So my last question to you before I open up for audience questions is, what are good forums to dialogue on this? You know, because clearly this is it's an interesting topic and it clearly has resonance. But how should we further this conversation, include more people in the dialogue, also include diverse points of view, and what's the suggestion on that?
No, I'd love to hear from the audience, but I think this is a great forum, and I think the festival you've organized is amazing. This is a really important kind of forum where we can start talking about it. I definitely think we need a lot more research in this field, funded, where we start articulating a psychotherapy for India, by India. And as we've talked about, I developed a psychotherapy called integral self-therapy that combines the experience of non-duality, which is transcendence, if you like, through meditation, with Western psychotherapeutic techniques. And so I think we need more therapies that are born from this country, that use the rich insights we already had, and rather than allow the West to appropriate that. For example, the way they did with mindfulness. That's a terrible word, by the way. I don't use that. Mindfulness, I mean, the practice is beautiful, right? But mindfulness, by the way, is a classic example of why we all need to wake up and start, making sure. And the worst thing is, nowadays, we in India are being certified by some guy in the West on mindfulness, which came from Gautama Buddha from 450 BC, called Sati or Smriti. I mean, the original was, where did the word come from, right? Mindfulness came from some British guy called William Rhys Davies. He was a bureaucrat in the late 19th century, 1800 something, goes to Sri Lanka, no interest in meditation, probably never meditated in his life. I looked it up. I couldn't find any documentation of the guy meditating. So then he is interested in the Pali language and in Theravada Buddhism, great. Then he translated the word smriti, which means remembrance, into mindfulness. And then took mindfulness back to the West, and then in 1970, John Kabat-Zinn, who is not a psychiatrist or psychologist, is a molecular biologist, then took the word mindfulness and had promoted it by calling it mindfulness-based stress reduction. It is now a $10 billion industry, and Gautama Buddha must be rolling in his grave. Because he left the kingdom. What's going on? But mindfulness is a horrible word. I'll tell you why. Because even in the West, when you say, be mindful of that, the idea it's connoting is extreme being careful, right? You have to be watchful, mindful. You're not, that is exactly what you shouldn't do in mindfulness or smriti. It is actually what Jittu Krishnamurti beautifully called choiceless awareness. We had so many better words for it in English, and we could have called it smriti and let the world learn smriti rather than Indians learning the word mindfulness for a practice that came from this country. Am I the only one who is irritated by this? So this really bothers me.
Sure.
And firstly, it wasn't even, it's got a lot of nuance to it, which mindfulness lacks.
Sure.
Sorry, I got totally carried away.
No, but
What were you talking about? Sorry. I told her just keep me in check because I get a little worked up about these.
No.
These
I think no. I wanted to know what you think has changed, but I get the gist, and I was going to throw a fun question of what are your least favorite mental health buzzwords and trends, but I think I covered those. So I do want.
Why don't you really tell me how you feel?
No, so I would actually. I think the audience would love to. Yeah, we've got lots of hands up. So I just have one request. Please limit yourself to one question because we like to get everybody in, and we have mics floating around, and we'll cover all three rows.
Hi, sir. So I'm a second year undergraduate student. I'm studying psychology, and we just started our semester, and the curriculum is completely Western. Like, we're learning about medieval time psychology, and like there's not a single mention of Indian psychology. And this did come up in our class, like, why are you not teaching us Indian stuff? Because we are in India. We are going to practice in India. So, but it's just not there in the curriculum, and I don't think it's going to be there for a while. It takes a lot of time for rules and policies to come. So what can I as an individual, as a student do to, because there's a lot of information online and we don't know what is true. So what can I as a student do to learn more about Eastern psychology?
Firstly, thank you for that interest and for pointing it out already. I think this is going to emerge because people like you, and I think this is a growing movement in our country in many areas where there's an increasing awareness and pride of what we have had in our heritage. So I think it's happening, and I would suggest that those of you who are really keen on that form study groups in your organization. In your colleges. Go online, as you said. There's a lot of commentaries. You can start with a lot of things which are psychotherapeutic or psychological in our country were under the realm of spirituality or religion even. Religion or spirituality was the answer to human existential and psychological problems. We didn't start having problems only in the last 100 years, right? Ever since humanity has been born, and by the way, any rich culture which ascended Maslow's hierarchy, as ancient India must have done, where you did not have to make ends meet, that was not the only imperative. We were thinking as a culture about the highest, most beautiful, most important things, which is, what does it mean to be born? What is the point of life? How do you find happiness? How do you deal with the traumatic events in everybody's life, which, by the way, the current trauma-informed narratives, I think, don't capture, when I think about it, because, hello, you're going to die, is existentially the truth. And I'm saying that to put existential context on the idea that there are, there's a reason that spirituality, religion, and psychotherapy have been part of the same dialogue. And the separation of church and state, of religion and mind, one understands why, but when you come to India, you'll have to go into those texts, start looking into it and reading. For example, the Gita, thought of as a religious text, is probably one of the greatest dialogues about attaining a state of flow. Long before the unpronounceable psychologist, if you can say his name, Chicken Mihai. Anyway, there was a psychologist in the 70s, 80s who came up with the idea of flow, right? And we know the flow is really good for mental health. It's a peak experience. And it happens when you surrender the self and merge into action. So what I would suggest, looking at texts, having a study group, and then analyze it from a scientific, articulating it in the Western psychotherapeutic model. I think it does have to be articulated in a way where, just take away some of those religious connotations so that you understand what is the spirit of that. But thank you. It's a great thing that you're interested in that.
Okay, we'll go that side. Any question from there? Can we get a mic there?
Yeah. I'm Sahana, sir. I'm the curator at Indian Music Experience Museum. And since you talk about the Eastern approach, what do you think the role of music is in mental health? And given the numbers in our country, do you think that could be a great tool for self-help?
Absolutely. That's fascinating. It's great to hear of your interest in mental health and music. That's wonderful. No, absolutely. Music is a wonderful way to modulate mood. And I think one that most, if not all of us, use in some ways to help us feel something or connect with a certain feeling. And of course, there are more formal music therapy courses. It's a wonderful way where people can, and it's interesting that the taste in music, there isn't one therapeutic song, for example. What is therapeutic to a young person might be quite untherapeutic to someone else. My own music tastes have changed quite radically, you know. So, but yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. Music, a lot of things, right? I mean, things that we, you know, mental health in that sense, for example, research tells us that aromas are good for health, certain aromas. It tells us that engagement with nature is a very powerful thing. The music of bird sound has been shown to improve, decrease anxiety and decrease the risk of depression. They've actually done studies where they play a recording of bird sound, so even devoid of nature, you know. That's how integrated, by the way, our brains are with the natural environment. And so I think music is like that. It's part of the sensory experience that connects us with healing.
But it also goes to the point that you made, which is actually we know it in our body. We actually just feel better when you listen to it. So you sort of know it without it needing to be scientifically proven also, although it has been.
Yeah.
But we'll perhaps move on here.
This is Prasoon.
Yes, sir.
I am a software engineer, and I've also lived in the US and here. And during one of the discussion with a, I don't know if I should use the term shrink in US. Okay, so so my shrink, she happened to be psychotherapist. She happened to be, let me use the formal word actually. Psychotherapist was she was a Chinese American, I think, and she said, I want to experiment with yin and yang with you. And I was like, and I want to be different from the way you have spoken to the earlier, kind of white guys. That's what she said. And
Your question?
yeah. So then my question is, what you're talking about. Can we also combine things from other Eastern philosophies, not just India, right? Let's leave aside the politics and other things. Thanks.
You know, it's essentially the same thing, actually. That's more or less. Prana, chi. In other words, it's interesting, actually, when you look at the entire East and all Eastern healing traditions, or any primitive culture, so to primitive according to the West, they all had holism embedded in the ways in which they thought of disease. And the terminology that they used may have been different, but they were talking about the same things. For example, the chakra system, the meridian system, the chi, the prana, these are all the same things, whether you use Chinese or Indian words. So I've never been, personally, I haven't delved too much into Chinese medicine myself. When I was in the US, I had started an integrative medicine center, and there it was easier for me to get a Chinese medicine person than Ayurveda. So I did have a Chinese medicine person, but call it misplaced patriotism or something. I didn't. I always felt I need Ayurveda, you know. But I think it's the same thing, Prasoon. I don't think so at all. I think the problem is the vocabulary is so different that to the Western scientists, the idea of Vata, Pitta, Kapha sounds ridiculous. Because the language of holism is different from the language of reductionism and causality. I think the language and the approach in Western medicine makes it hard for us to appreciate that even, mind doesn't cause body reaction or body doesn't cause mind reaction. They are one thing.
Yeah.
They happen at the same time that you're angry. The electrical signals in your brain, the chest tightening, they're one thing. So we don't have sort of a language of holism in the West. In the East, they don't have the language of reductionism. So both sound quite insane to the other, by the way, But they both have truth. They're both seeing it in different ways.
Can we get the gentleman at the back?
Yeah. So since I think workplace well-being was mentioned, I just wanted to ask, in a culture like ours where we naturally grow up to be way more competitive than collaborative, which is done by the education system, which was more like a after party of the colonial system that we have had. So what can the system do to address workplace well-being? Like what can the leaders in the system do to address?
I think we did cover that a little bit.
We covered that, but I'll just say I really don't think we should wait for the leaders or the organization or indeed anyone else. I think every individual, and I do talk about collectivism and the idea that, all of that, but I do know that we are when you say our culture, I don't know, I think basically there's a homogenization of culture across the world, right? Today, when we talk about the kind of culture that we live in urban India, it's not that dissimilar from urban areas around the world. What you're going to see increasingly is homogenization around the world. America itself is quite homogeneous. One place looks pretty much like the other. India is starting to become more homogeneous as we get more orderly and more processes, and the similar institutions and similar restaurants and so on and so forth start propping up. And then culturally, everyone will be homogeneous, whether you're from Lucknow or London or Bangalore, because you're all aspiring for and desiring the same things. So I think the new culture is kind of global, whatever you want to call it, global, individualistic, capitalistic culture, which we are a part of. And in this culture, I think one of the key things is we do have to make our own health a priority, because you are making a choice. Everyone who goes to work is making a choice every single day. It may be a difficult choice, but they should never forget that they are making a choice. And that choice often entails certain difficulties. And again, that is a choice. And I think we should never forget that.
Sure.
Because many times organizations, as I say, may or may not worry about your health. They may not be able to do so. But the individual definitely needs to do so, because they are the only person who's going to experience the outcomes of their own, habits.
We have two last questions. We'll go with you first.
Sir, I'm a yoga physician, and throughout our post-graduation, we were pushed to do research-based studies for creating evidence of how yoga will work for different diseases or disorders, or even in a potentially healthy person. But considering RCTs are the highest form of research that we can do, how do you think we can create evidence-based studies when every person has different symptoms to the same disorder, or a set of symptoms which correlate to different disorders, and every person responds differently to different practices in yoga? So in what direction should the research go?
This is a very good question, and a fundamental problem that makes these practices from the East hard to find widespread acceptance in the West. In a way, the tail is wagging the dog. Because we have randomized placebo-controlled trials, the study and the nature of treatment has to fit the design construct. And you're absolutely right. In real world, the truth is there's so much individual variation that how do you study that at a population basis? And today when young people, and by the way, the idea of science has been raised to the extent that we say, okay, if it's science, it's true, but the question is, what is the science? What do you mean by science? Is the science a certain construct that will preclude other insights? And actually that has happened. Right? Rich anecdotal evidence from practitioners all over the world has no place in randomized placebo-controlled trials. So I think this is a huge problem. I think it'll need multiple studies. And actually, to be honest, to me, is the point we are asking, do you need to prove it through randomized placebo-controlled trials? If that's the question, you can easily construct studies to do so. That's how much I think these, we all know, anyone who's done scientific studies knows that there's a lot of room in psychiatry study. It depends on what outcome measures you use. It depends on the sample population. It depends on the power of the study, So honestly, the very basis of the science itself, I think, does not lend itself to integrative work. And that's a real problem. I don't have an answer for that. So one, I've been actively thinking. I have some ideas, and maybe we can talk separately about that. But thank you for that question.
Sure, thanks. We'll
By the way, this is exactly the reason why therapies such as cognitive therapy have become big. Cognitive therapy is big not because it's the best, but because it lends itself to randomized placebo-controlled trials. Again, it's fit into the trial, hence it's better, hence more people study it, hence more people want it, and it's just like a, what's it, like a Ponzi scheme? No, is that? Sorry, maybe wrong. There's something wrong with that.
Self-reinforcing.
Self-reinforcing. Sorry.
All right. We will take one last question from the lady there.
I'm Yashmi, and we're building emotional intelligence tools for parents. My question is about AI. AI in mental health, I wanted your opinion on that. And secondly, also, because AI models today are trained more on Western data, how does that affect the future of AI used in mental health in the East?
You want my dystopian... No, I mean, look, I think that the future, unless something changes, will be an extrapolation of the present, correct? And the present, where we are now, where we are moving, is increased interaction in virtual worlds. And all the big tech has already announced that they're moving towards neural implants, and that definitively all things will move from outside us to within us. I think we look back at this time when we were looking at phones as a weird, quaint little time in human history when what was so essential to this human being was outside them. Because there'll be a generation very soon, maybe in 50 years, where we'll be born with implants, and at that point, you will not be able to discern what is outside yourself and what is inside yourself. In the metaverse, already, they can talk to holograms. I don't know if you saw Meta's latest release. It's still a kind of a prototype, but it's happening. What that means is you can see holograms just like people who are going to be powered by AI, and you can have full-blown conversations with this hologram. Already, you can see that people have relationships with virtual people. It's only going to get more. So I think the dystopian future is individuals whose loneliness is now fulfilled by hologram figures where you probably have to pay per month to have a conversation. And I think that's going to happen very shortly. So AI, the problem, as you said, a couple of problems, right? One is that AI is definitely here to stay. There's no doubt about it. AI already has become amazing at chat. And if you just look at the content of the chat, could potentially be better than some younger therapists, less experienced therapists. Just the content of the chat. But it doesn't feel anywhere near the same thing, right? There's no human experience. There's no connection. So I think it's going to be interesting for us to see in our field the difference between the content and something ephemeral or intangible rather, which is the heart, the human connection, something that you cannot put your finger on. But in the dystopian future, your therapist will be a holographic figure. And what is wrong with that? You see, it takes me to Indian philosophy, which always said, this is Maya. Indian philosophy was one step ahead of the game. They said, you're already in a virtual reality called Maya. It is true, where your head glasses are this brain. This brain is not showing us reality. We all agree scientifically, this brain is showing you a splice of what's out there. There's only certain wavelengths, only certain auditory spectrums, only certain visual spectrums your brain can see. The moment you're born, you put on the virtual reality glasses of your brain, see the Maya of the world, and the idea in the East is you take it off and you're in transcendent infinite bliss. So
my screen is telling me, which is that the time is up, and of course we know the time is also minutes and seconds are also a construction. So sticking with Maya, yes, exactly. Time is actually a different dimension. But this has been a riveting conversation. Of course, there's lots more here, and we would love to continue to host platforms where these kinds of conversations and much more dialogue can happen.
Thank you so much.
But I wanted to just please one round of applause for Dr. Shyam, please.
Thank you, appreciate it.